Hi, everybody. Welcome. If you are here for the Lerner workshop in Religion and Society, you're in the right place. Thank you for coming. We were just discussing the history of this illustrious lecture series a moment ago, and I counted on the website. There have been 10 Lerner lectures over the last little more than 10 years. It was an annual event, and then the pandemic happened, and we didn't have an in-person event at all for the last few years. And so this is our first Lerner lecture back in person in several years. It is not our first as a religious studies department, but we are a relatively new department. We used to be a program, just a little religious studies history. We used to be a program. Now we are a department. So, in some ways this is a celebration. Thank you all for coming to celebrate us as a religious studies department here in our, continually pandemic world. But we'll talk about some connections to healing and medicine in a moment. Other things to say, the Lerner Foundation gave us a generous gift, which is the namesake for this lecture series. Jonathan A. Lerner graduated from NYU in 2007, which just happens to be the year that I also graduated from undergraduate, so we could have been friends. He had a degree in religious studies and Middle Eastern and Islamic studies, and I'll read a quote from him. He hopes that this lecture series will help bring people together who want to learn more about religion and bring more attention to the department. So I hope that describes all of you. Today we have the pleasure of inviting Pierce Salguero, who I think we advertised him as an associate professor, but he's a full professor. I think relatively recently, within the past few months, he's been promoted to full professor of Asian history and religious studies at Pennsylvania State University's Abington College. If you go to his website, you'll learn many very interesting things about him. He describes himself as a transdisciplinary scholar of health humanities who is fascinated by historical and contemporary intersections between Buddhism, medicine, and cross-cultural exchange. So, as you can tell, his research repertoire is vast, much broader than he'll be able to discuss in just one lecture. So if you have any questions about connections between what he's presenting today and history and various other aspects that he might touch upon more briefly, then please feel free to ask. He's the author of several books, 3 academic books, plus 1 trade book, 2 of which came out this year. So A Global History of Buddhism and Medicine, where some of you are reading along with me in our course. He also has a popular book called Buddhist, which I saw at a bookstore. I was very proud to say, I know one of these authors in this bookstore. He's also the editor of collected volumes. He's the author of over a dozen academic articles and book chapters. He's published many popular articles. He's the editor-in-chief of the Asian Medicine Journal, which I'm also involved with. He's also just started a podcast, and that's something we can look forward to coming out in the coming months. He is the organizer, and we could say director of the Jivaka Project, which is a project about mapping the relationship between Buddhism and medicine in the modern world. He's written about pedagogy, he's led workshops, he's given countless talks, and so, again, it's all just to say we are very fortunate to have Pierce here today, Professor Salguero here today, so please join me in welcoming him, and please stay to have a conversation after his lecture on meditation sickness. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for the glowing introduction. Bill and I have been friends since, maybe like 6 or 7 years, and I've appreciated all the collaborations that we've done. And what he didn't mention in any of that really elaborate introduction is how much my work has been dependent on the work of specialists like Bill who work on Buddhism and medicine in particular. times and places throughout the world. While I feel like a lot of what I do, I am a specialist in medieval China, but I feel like a lot of the work that I do is kind of pulling together scholars into conversation with one another, and Bill's been a great conversation partner for me personally over the many years. So it's great to be here in New York, see you in person. I wanted to thank Janine and everybody else. I met so many people, I don't know all your names, who was involved with the setup and the helping out here to make this happen. So I really appreciate all of the support that we've had here. And thank you to all of you. I understand that there's very few, or maybe not none at all, of these on-campus, in-person type events. And so I'm glad to be here to kick off sort of like a, back to the tradition of in-person events. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm talking today about emerging research, something that's new direction for me. But like Bill said, it does have some tie-ins with previous work that I'm happy to talk about. So what I'll be talking about today starts with, I want to start with a post from the summer of 2021 when a user of the Dharma Overground website asked for help and advice. So this is an online discussion board founded by the American Buddhist author and personality Daniel M. Ingram. And the homepage describes itself as a forum and support group for pragmatic and diligent meditators. So this user wrote seeking help with recent difficulties that had arisen in their heart chakra after participating in a 12-day solo meditation retreat. And they described what was occurring as, you can see here, an anxious ball of energy. It intensifies, burns, radiates, and gives a general feeling of anxiousness. This user is not alone. Reports of energetic chaos, anxiety, depression, psychosis, hallucinations, and other adverse effects as a result of participating in intensive meditation have been seen frequently on this forum in the last few years. Just a few months later, after this post, a different member reported that she was experiencing what she called kundalini energy as a result of intensively practicing meditation and qigong. Her symptoms were to the extent that bystanders had called paramedics for her on at least one occasion. She said she was experiencing seizures, all kinds of spontaneous movement, a lot of uncontrollable shaking, eyes rolling in the back of her head, big intakes of breath and vibrations up the central channel, like the core of her body. So while some reports of meditation gone wrong have come from meditators who are practicing on their own without supervision from qualified teachers, it's also not uncommon for such events to occur within formal retreats. Another long-term meditator on the forum reported that he'd been hospitalized due to symptoms that began during a 10-day Vipassana meditation course. The insomnia and energy flows intensified when he got back home, ultimately leading to what he called pronounced sexual weirdness and other bizarre symptoms. In his words, suddenly my body starts rolling around on the bed, there's dancing, there's spinning, then I felt strong hands push me onto the bed and begin to ravish me sexually. I could feel my gender changing from male to female and back again. Was I possessed by a spirit? Sleep was impossible. On the third day, I had my friends take me to the hospital. A week later, I was discharged with a prescription for a powerful antipsychotic. He goes on to say that after a month or so, he became severely depressed. So it's not only on Dharma Overground that one finds these kinds of firsthand reports from meditators in crisis. The website of cheetahhouse.org, an organization that describes itself as offering resources for meditators in crisis, had an anonymous account that tells of dark forces invading the body and mind during a 60-day meditation retreat in Myanmar. Hallucinations and visions. I experienced myself transforming into a dark, disturbing figure. Something was trying to make its way out of me as it thrashed my body in all different directions. Visions, voices, paranoia. I began having trouble walking, holding my limbs in place. Something felt terribly wrong. I began to fear for my life. It was terrifying. Everything became dark and depressing. So myself, a historian of medieval Chinese Buddhist healing practices, these firsthand reports from meditators in crisis caught my eye. It actually was not the first time that I'd heard of the possibility of undesirable mental or physical symptoms arising from the practice of meditation. Indeed, I'd already written about this phenomenon with regard to two different historical texts back in 2014 and 2017 in some of those books that Bill mentioned earlier. But when I read the contemporary accounts of meditators in distress, I was struck by their uncanny similarities with the medieval Chinese material. And that in turn got me wondering what, if anything, the historical texts might contribute to our understanding of the potential dangers of meditation, and whether exploring these parallels across time and cultural contexts might contribute to the development of solutions for these particular conditions. And so this afternoon, that's what I'm going to be sharing with you, is the results of my considerations and thinking in terms of putting the past and the present into dialogue. So before exploring the medieval Chinese texts themselves, I want to dwell a little bit more on the contemporary Western discourses. So probably everybody in this room is aware that the positive effects of mindfulness and other Buddhist meditations have been enthusiastically studied by many types of scholars for several decades now. On the plus side, this has resulted in enormous benefit for people who are seeking stress reduction techniques, and I'm imagining that many of the people in this room have done that themselves. But meanwhile, on the downside, this has resulted in something of a popular media juggernaut, where mindfulness is often characterized as a panacea. While the benefits have gotten all of the press, the potential side effects have received far less attention. Recently, however, meditation-related challenges have emerged as an object of scientific study. This has been led by Willoughby Britton and Jared Lindahl's lab at Brown University, and an increasing number of qualitative and clinical studies have now identified a range of potential negative side effects. You see some of them listed here on the slide. As the number of studies have increased over the past few years, there's been some variability in the precise phenomenon that is being measured. So in one study, Goldberg et al. Found that 32.3% of meditators experienced MRAEs, which are meditation-related adverse effects. On the other hand, Farias et al. Said that 8.3% of their sample experienced meditation adverse effects. Or we have Britton et al., who found that meditation-related adverse effects with negative valences occurred in 58% of mindfulness programs, while Baer et al. Found that 3 to 7% of participants felt that they had experienced harm from mindfulness. So these discrepancies can be understood as being a product of the fact that each one of these studies use different terminologies and has different criteria for inclusion. And so at present, my point is, at present, there's still no agreed upon definition of what constitutes a negative outcome, and there's no universally consistent statistics on the prevalence. An additional complication is that a lot of the scientific studies understand meditation experiences strictly through a biomedical lens, and they don't always seem informed about Buddhist meditation theory. For example, Farias et al. Included among their list of adverse effects auditory and visual hallucinations, perceptual hypersensitivity, quote, altered sense of self and world, and out-of-body experiences. Now, those of you who maybe have taken one of Bill's classes might know that actually all of those are considered to be desirable, or at least unsurprising outcomes of Buddhist meditation by many different groups of meditators. Uniquely, Britton and Lindahl's project at Brown that I mentioned earlier has undertaken extensive ethnographic interviews with Buddhist meditation teachers and practitioners, leading to less biomedically focused approaches and more inclusion of Buddhist perspectives in their analyses. So their studies are therefore more likely to parse out when certain phenomena are desirable or detrimental based on the practitioner's understandings and expectations. So all of that research is still in a nascent phase, but I do think it's, at least to me, it seems that it's safe to say that despite these variances, there's a consensus that's emerging in this research that intensive meditation practice may not be a good fit for everyone. Rather than being a universal panacea or a completely safe spiritual practice, it seems that participants are in danger, at least some are, of experiencing unwanted mental, physical, and behavioral side effects from meditation. And it seems that sometimes these symptoms can be terrifying, debilitating, and even life-threatening. So in tandem with the emerging academic research, public awareness of the potential dangers of meditation have recently begun to rise as well. High-profile media outlets, as varied as Harper's, Esquire, Daily Mail, Vice, The Atlantic, and The Guardian, actually began featuring meditation gone wrong stories as far back as the mid-2000s, and the frequency of those reports seems to have increased over time. Public awareness has been fueled in part by Britton and Lindahl themselves. They have sent out press releases about their research, and they've appeared on podcasts and TED Talks, on social media, and in all kinds of other popular media venues. Britton herself founded the Cheetah House organization that I previously mentioned in order to help meditators in crisis connect with resources, video consultations, and also personalized guidance for dealing with their symptoms. The organization is also involved in raising public awareness of the potential problems with meditation through social media campaigns, such as this one on the screen, and other methods of outreach. While it's still a relatively new organization, their website received 22,000 unique visitors in 2021 and is on track to be even more popular in 2022. And those are statistics from Lindahl himself. Meanwhile, additional public attention has been drawn to the issue through the efforts of Daniel M. Ingram, the Buddhist author and personality that I mentioned earlier as the founder of the Dharma Overground website. At the time that I wrote this paper a couple of weeks ago, the website had approximately 3,600 users and 176,000 posts on a variety of topics, not all of them related to adverse effects of meditation. But he's also been a regular guest on podcasts devoted to Buddhism and spirituality, and he's also written a controversial meditation guide that strongly warns readers about the negative experiences that meditators can encounter as a result of what he calls hardcore practice. Ingram is also a retired emergency department physician, and he's founded a charitable organization and a research consortium dedicated to supporting scientific and academic research focused on what he calls emergent phenomena. This is echoing the notion of spiritual emergency that was pioneered by Christina and Stanislav Goff. And this term, in Ingram's usage, explicitly includes all kinds of energetic symptoms, kundalini, visions, spirit possession, and other quote-unquote weirdness that might arise as a result of meditation practice, whether experienced positively or negatively. As Ingram has put it in numerous public interviews, one of his chief goals for the organization is to ensure that people are aware of the possibilities of emergent phenomena, including potentially adverse effects before they start meditating, so that they have informed consent about the risks and benefits, just as they would when undertaking any other kind of therapeutic activity. The vision statement on the Cheetah House website has a similar statement as well. So while the potential dangers of meditation are coming under increasing scrutiny in research labs and are becoming more widely known by the public, a number of Western Buddhist teachers and leaders have weighed in with contrary viewpoints. In general, these defenders of meditation have acknowledged that practitioners occasionally get into trouble, but they've emphasized some counter-arguments. First, that adverse effects do not happen when one is properly instructed in the practice of meditation by a legitimate teacher with genuine insight. Second, that they primarily affect Western meditators who are too culturally unprepared and doctrinally uninformed to successfully participate in meditation retreats. Third, that they're the result of latent psychological issues that may emerge during meditation but are not necessarily caused by it. So the picture being painted in these kinds of responses is that well-prepared and well-trained practitioners can safely engage in properly structured, well-led meditation retreats without concern for adverse effects. And they also often argue that meditation centers have adequate measures in place to screen out practitioners who may potentially be harmed. So I'm neither a clinical researcher nor a Buddhist, so I do not have a strong personal stake in the outcomes of these particular debates. However, as a historian of Buddhism and medicine in Asia, I do take the position that both the researchers of adverse effects and the defenders of meditation that I've just been talking about would gain a lot from changing their current practice of almost exclusively centering Western voices. Commentators may periodically cite famous Asian meditation teachers and authorities such as S.N. Goenka or Mahasi Sayadaw and others, or they might introduce passages from ancient Buddhist scripture or commentaries such as the Visuddhimagga, which is an often cited 5th century Pali text. Many of the Western meditators interviewed in studies by Lindahl and others use Asian vocabularies and doctrines to frame their experiences. But thus far, neither side has deeply engaged with any non-Western, non-English speaking practitioners on the question of the safety of meditation. Given that the vast majority of Buddhist meditators now and throughout history have been Asian, it seems to me that this is an urgent priority that would help to move the conversation forward. So I have not conducted formal fieldwork myself either, but in speaking, whenever I've raised this topic of potential dangers with Asian monastics, I'm invariably told that this is a well-known phenomenon that's discussed openly within Buddhist monastic institutions in Asia. So I think a study of Asian meditation teachers that translated their knowledge about the prevention and treatment of meditation-related adverse effects would be of immense value. And at the very least, such a study would militate against the notion that this is a problem that only affects culturally unprepared Western practitioners. So that kind of systematic ethnographic research remains to be done, but some of these missing voices are already available piecemeal through the works of academic historians and ethnographers. This is not a comprehensive list, but extant scholarship that has touched on the adverse effects of spiritual practice includes studies of pre-modern Buddhist writings on meditation sickness from the East, from East Asia, descriptions of wind disorders in historical meditation manuals from Southeast Asia, and ethnographic studies conducted among Tibetan Buddhists. And if we cast the net a little bit more widely, I suspect there may also be some value in comparing the side effects of Buddhist-style meditation with those that reportedly can result from Taoist practices of inner alchemy, from Qigong, from Christian prayer, and from other forms of intensive spiritual practices. So when I've looked through this literature, I've noticed some common themes emerging. And I guess I should plug my book too, because many of these works that are discussed here are actually found in one of these anthologies that I edited. So when I've perused this literature myself, I've noticed some common themes emerging. Potential symptoms, including strange sensations, unexplained pains, psychological instability, hallucinations, sexual abnormalities, uncontrollable behaviors, demonic possession, suicidality, and so forth. They seem to be well known and well documented across these traditions. They often seem to be understood as the unfortunate but not entirely surprising results of intensive spiritual practice. And if we read the ethnographic and historical accounts alongside the contemporary clinical research and the firsthand reports from the Western meditators in crisis, I can't help but wondering what we might learn from this cross-cultural comparison. Frequently, the traditions that I'm talking about here claim to have knowledge of preventative or therapeutic techniques. Extant Buddhist texts from medieval China, for example, contain a particularly robust amount of information about the diagnosis, the treatment, and the prevention of unwanted meditation symptoms. So how might such sources speak to our contemporary concerns? There are many texts in the Sino-Japanese canon that talk about the potential dangers of meditation. So here I'm going to briefly overview 4 of them to provide a representative sample of different types of Buddhist literature and a range of contents. All 4 of the texts that I'm going to talk about are known to have been highly influential in their time and are widely cited in other sources. These texts also have the advantage that they're all available, or in one case, they're soon to be available in scholarly English translations. So I highly encourage you to consult those publications in order to consider these texts and their contents in more depth than I'm going to be able to do here. So the first text to consider is Discourse number 797 from the Samyutta Agama. Though the Chinese translation of this text dates from the 5th century, this is an even earlier Buddhist story with multiple parallels in the Sutra and Vinaya literature, in Pali, Sanskrit, and Tibetan, in addition to the Chinese. The editions of the text have been compared and analyzed, and the discourse translated in full by Bhikkhu Analayo. So this text relates a time when the Buddha spoke to a group of monks about the practice of meditation on impurity, or Ashubha Bhavana. This is a type of meditation that's widely praised throughout the canon in all Buddhist languages, where the practitioner is instructed to see the human body as loathsome and disgusting. But as a result of fervently engaging in this practice, in this sutra, members of the monastic community begin to commit suicide en masse. Later, when the Buddha's assistant Ananda requests a more suitable teaching for the monks, the Buddha recommends mindfulness of the breath instead. The problem in this text, according to its translator, Anayalo, appears to be that the monks engaged in this particular kind of practice with too much intensity, and the text represents mindfulness of the breath as something of an antidote to this more extreme form of asceticism. It's also interesting to note that meditation on impurity is actually one of the primary forms of mindfulness of the body in Buddhist scriptures. So this implies that it's changing the object of mindfulness from impurity to the breath that leads to the alleviation of symptoms, rather than mindfulness itself being an antidote. Another text, the Shurangama Sutra, is an 8th century apocryphon. That means a domestic Chinese composition that's made to look like it's a translation of a Sanskrit text. The historical context of this sutra has been previously analyzed by James Benn, who's written about it, published about it many years ago, and he's currently engaged in translating that into English. Much of this text concerns the Buddha's teachings on the proper way to engage in meditation. In the concluding sections of the text, after having given detailed instructions, the Buddha warns about certain dangers that can arise for advanced practitioners. I'll let you read that one for yourselves. So after he gives this warning, the Buddha goes on to list 50 demonic states in which meditators can become stuck. The majority of these actually represent doctrinal heterodoxies, or deviations from Chinese Mahayana viewpoints, such as believing that death is final, believing that Buddhas and Bodhisattvas can be female, denying causation, making false apocalyptic prophecies, or becoming a follower of another religion. These are all demonic states that are listed in this text. But others include developing grandiose or narcissistic self-image, or seeing oneself as greater than the Buddhas, or becoming a charismatic leader of a heterodox sect, or cultivating special powers and abilities. But interspersed along with all of those are several conditions that parallel the adverse effects of meditation that are found in the contemporary clinical literature and the self-reports that we discussed earlier. So some of these demonic states include symptoms like hallucinations, extreme sorrow, despondency, anxiety, euphoria, including laughing, dancing, and singing uncontrollably, suicidality, and also possession by ghosts or demons. So those first two examples focus primarily on mental and emotional imbalances, but this next one includes both mental and physical ailments. So the Secret Essential Methods for Curing Meditation Sickness is a sutra that was reputedly translated into Chinese in 455 CE, but which actually represents a hybrid of both Indian and Chinese materials and lies in this kind of in-between translation and creation. This sutra is also a composite constructed by combining two previously independent texts together. Its complex history has been written about extensively, and the whole text has been translated by Eric Green. So Secret Essentials contains what I believe might be the earliest known descriptions of the tantric subtle body network of channels and winds. At least it's the first in the Chinese context. It's also the earliest to present a detailed examination of the cause, diagnosis, and treatment of what it calls meditation sickness. The sutra opens with this vignette about meditation gone wrong, which again you can quickly read, skim through on the slide. So this is a group of adept monks who are deep in meditation. They're disturbed by some noises, and this causes their wind element to be disturbed, which causes madness. As a historian of medicine, I find this text fascinating as a melting pot of medical models, and I've written about it elsewhere. There are sections of the text that explain meditation sickness by drawing on tantric physiology, that stimuli entering through the sensory organs agitate the winds in the central channels of the subtle body and provoke madness and other kinds of strange behaviors. But elsewhere, the text focuses on symptoms caused by imbalances of the four elements, the constituents of the body according to Indian philosophy and medicine: earth, water, fire, and wind. So those symptoms include emotional turmoil, digestive issues, backache, headache, skin problems, sensory issues, and other kinds of ailments. And then other sections present an indigenous Chinese model, such as one passage that describes how having reversed qi can lead to stagnation in the chest and leaky joints, roiling blood, headaches, swollen back, and seized up tendons. And then still other portions of the text describe how demons can attack the meditator, causing madness, unpleasant sounds and visions, erratic behavior, blurry vision, pain, itches, fluttering, twitching, numbness, erotic sensations, and so forth. And then there's a number of other symptoms of meditation sickness that are described throughout the text that include a whole range of psychological and behavioral symptoms, like excessive desire for sex, obsessive thoughts about music, beauty, singing, and poetry, fixation on personal gain, grandiosity, narcissism, falsely representing attainments, and also repeatedly breaking the moral precepts. So the fourth and final example is a section of a lengthy meditation manual by Zhi Yi, 6th century meditation teacher, that provides a great amount of detail about physical symptoms that can arise from meditation practice. So this text has been translated and discussed in detail by Paul Swanson. Zhi Yi's discussion begins with a general analysis of the relationship of illness to Buddhist doctrine and practice, and he's also combining Chinese and Indian models together. And then the text hones in on the subject of ailments caused by what he calls unregulated meditation. And here, Zhi Yi enumerates 6 main causes. So the first is breathing in a way that's not in sync with the quality of the sensations that are arising. Number 2 is exclusively focusing on shamatha meditations and eschewing other forms of meditation. Shamatha are meditations that are focused on concentrating and relaxing the mind. Or number 3 is being unregulated or one-sided when practicing vipassana meditations. And vipassana meditations are the other category of Buddhist meditations that involve more of inquiry and analysis. So he also includes attack by demonic spirits that cause physical symptoms, attack by Mara demons, which cause mental symptoms, and also karmic consequences of one's actions. So these are all causes of illness that can arise in meditation. He gives a lot more detail about each of these that I'm going to be able to go into here. And the chapter also goes on to contain a fascinating section that presents Zhi Yi's understanding of how to think about illness within a Buddhist worldview, and also how moral discipline empowers a person to overcome illness. He has a final section where he presents 10 contemplations on illness that use the occasion of illness as an opportunity to propel a meditator further along in their Buddhist practice. So I encourage you to check out these texts in more details. So we saw in the narrative presented in the Samyukta Agma, the first The first example, that the Buddha teaches mindfulness of the breath as a kind of antidote to this overly intense practice of meditation on impurity. And the other texts that we talked about also agree that meditation-related ailments can be alleviated within the context of meditation. So when experiencing the onset of symptoms, a well-informed meditator, they're suggesting, should pivot from their current practice to another kind of meditation technique that acts to counter and dispel the adverse effects that are arising. So two of the texts that I've just mentioned, Secret Essentials and Zhiyi's Meditation Manual, the last two, actually go into quite a bit of detail about these techniques. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time just looking at those recommendations. In the first instance, Secret Essentials mentions a number of therapeutic interventions throughout the text that do not specifically involve meditation. So there's all kinds of suggestions here, including the confession and repentance rituals like cleaning the monastic toilets if the troubles are arising because of having previously broken the precepts. Elsewhere, the text advocates bathing or limiting one's diet, chanting the name of a god in order for him to appear and heal the meditator. In another section, the Buddha provides a dharani, or an incantation, for the treatment of illness. And then late in the text, he provides a different incantation to banish a troublemaking demoness. But all of those examples aside, the vast majority of Secret Essentials is mainly concerned with overcoming the symptoms of meditation sickness using the practices of what Eric Green has translated as contemplation or meditative imagination, which are generically, I'm going to talk about those as two different forms of visualization. So interestingly, one of the techniques that the text recommends is in fact a kind of meditation on the impurity of the body. So this is the same practice that's vilified in the Samyutta Agama. So here the Buddha teaches this practice specifically to overcome obsessive and uncontrollable lust arising in meditation. The remedy for this condition involves a series of visualizations where the male and female bodies are contemplated as disgusting and infested with parasites. And then there's a therapeutic meditation given for obsessive greed, where the practitioner sees the things that they're craving as, these are quotes, hundreds of thousands of iron nails, or worms with iron beaks that will devour you, or poisonous snakes, or millions of brambles, or even boiling shit, and other kinds of repellent things. So the idea in these cases is to address the meditator's problematic mental and behavioral symptoms with this kind of counterbalancing visualization. In Chinese, that's known as inverse contemplation, or yiguan. So lust is overcome by disgust, and greed is overcome by repulsion, and pleasure is overcome by distaste, right? So that's also the logic behind a series of meditations that the Buddha teaches in order to cancel out the effects of one of the four elements getting out of control. So for example, heat-related symptoms due to an elevated fire element could be overcome by imagining cooling gemstones, or imagining vases of water and jumping into them. Or feeling that one's body has become overwhelmed by the earth element can be treated by imagining and contemplating the inherently empty or insubstantial nature of the body. Or feeling flooded by water can be tamed by contemplating a water fountain that channels all that liquid in a particular way and controls it. Or your out of control bodily winds can be captured by imagining a huge windmill, or a multi-headed dragon that sucks up all the wind into itself, right? So these are all counterbalancing visualizations. Just as common as counterbalancing in this text is the visualization of therapeutic procedures being conducted by divine beings of various kinds. So all kinds of beneficent entities are mentioned as appearing in the visualization and healing the meditator's body, including various kinds of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and Brahma and other devas and these angelic divine boys, little cherubic angels that come in various colors, There's Naga serpents and Garudas, the eagle gods, and other kinds of wondrous creatures that are visualized performing acupuncture, massage, trephination, which is opening up the cranium, applying all kinds of topical medicines to the skin and the hair, lancing with needles, irrigating the body or the subtle channels with butter and milk and ghee and medicinal herbs and all kinds of other liquids and salves. And then finally, perhaps the most common feature of the visualizations that are introduced in Secret Essentials, we might simply characterize as being protective or soothing imagery. So the Buddha teaches meditators to imagine pearls stopping up their ears and celestial canopies and adamantine mountains that provide barriers against unpleasant sounds. Or you can visualize bathing in milk to relax your body. There's also an emphasis on seeing divine beings preaching the Dharma, or the Brahma Viharas, or giving other kinds of auspicious teachings. And all kinds of other visualizations that I've described earlier, except for the impurity, the ones on impurity, the rest of them always involve these intricate sequences of gemstones and flowers and deities and mirrors and sun and moon and other kinds of auspicious and powerful protective objects in these kind of like kaleidoscopic or like fractal kind of arrays that are described in the text. So there's a passage, a sample passage or example from the text that ties together all of this. And so this is the Buddha is providing a visualization in order to heal uncontrollable behaviors that are caused by the wind agitating the heart. And here I'm just going to paraphrase the practice, but you're basically told to visualize your heart growing brighter until it becomes a fire jewel. And this jewel then emits a chi that permeates all of the channels in your subtle body. And then you visualize Brahma, the king of the devas, appears before you, and he's holding a white lotus flower, on top of which is one of those divine boys holding some fresh milk. And the boy emerges from the flower and pours the milk into the subtle channels of the meditator's body. And then he places golden flowers beside your heart and runs acupuncture needles through the flowers, piercing the heart a number of times. And then he rinses the heart out with milk. And all of this is supposed to be enormously relaxing. Okay, so I'm going to turn to the second text and talk about some of the section on illness in Zhiyi's meditation manual and the suggestions that he makes. And again, the best way to address the ill effects of meditation is to modify your meditation. So he makes a clear distinction between ailments caused by physical conditions, which should be treated with conventional medicine, and those that arise from issue with your practice. And when it comes to the latter, he says if your seated meditation leads to sickness, this should in turn require further sitting in meditation. So he introduces the following categories of therapies for meditation-induced ailments. He discusses each one in quite a bit of detail. So in the first case, using shamatha, and under this category we find him suggesting a number of different contemplations focusing on specific parts of the body. Using the 6 breaths, this is a practice well known from medieval Chinese Buddhist and Taoist and medical texts, which involves exhaling while gently forming the syllables. Counting the breaths. So this is modifying the breath in a number of specific ways to sync up with the quality of the sensations being experienced in order to help to counteract the symptoms. And in this section, he also mentions 12 different types of Indian pranayama breathing exercises. Number 4 is healing by conventional conceptions, meaning using techniques that involve the imagination but are not related to using qi and breath that he discussed earlier. Number 5 is healing by contemplation of the mind. This is the direct contemplation of the emptiness of the illness. And then number 6, magical techniques. And here he mentions a number of different incantations that are accompanied by breath retention and other kinds of practices. So each of these 6 sections includes a number of specific techniques, but I'm just going to go, because of interest of time, I'm just going to go into detail about the first section here regarding treating illness with shamatha. So here, Zhi introduces various ways that one can focus one's attention in order to bring unwanted symptoms under control. So first is fixing attention on the navel. Zhi says that while this practice may lead to deeper concentration, it's particularly effective in overcoming pain, itching, cold, and heat. Next is fixing attention on the dantian. So he describes this as a sea of qi that can absorb all diseases. And by focusing your mind on this spot and calming your breath, any disease can be healed. However, he then says if that doesn't work, then you can also try focusing on a point on your big toe instead. Next, if you're doing that previous exercise, if you feel any pain in your waist or your legs, then you should focus your mind on an imagined chasm that's 10 feet deep directly beneath where you sit. He recommends fixing attention to your feet, and here he says this technique is it's a way of bringing the energy down from your top of your body to the lower part of your body, and he calls this the best method of healing. There, you can fix your attention on the spot where the symptoms predominate. And finally, there's 2 more techniques that involve the Chinese and Indian medical models that are too detailed to get into that right now. So, having briefly kind of run through the contents of these medieval Chinese texts, I want to turn now to asking what these writings may have to contribute to present-day discussions about the potential dangers of meditation. So I want to begin by noting that as a historian of religion and not a devotee, I treat all Buddhist sutras, regardless of their origins, not as factual accounts of the activities or teachings of a historical Buddha and his followers, but rather as documents produced by particular communities in certain times and places in order to pursue specific rhetorical purposes. And if we look through that lens, it's clear to me that whatever other messages these texts might be conveying, all 4 are also telling us that multiple communities of medieval Chinese Buddhists considered meditation to be a potential cause of disease. These ailments sometimes included heterodox beliefs or other kinds of proclivities that in our modern context would not always be recognized as necessitating treatment. However, many of these symptoms are in fact legible to modern medicine and psychiatry. Although they're explained according to Chinese, Indian, demonic, karmic, ideological models, these medieval texts give us enough detail that we can understand the symptomatology being described and see parallels with contemporary firsthand accounts from meditators in crisis and with the data from contemporary research. I think such adverse experiences appear to have been common enough to warrant discussion across multiple genres, including translated sutras, domestic compositions, hybrid composite texts, and a manual by a leading meditation teacher of the medieval period. Tellingly, for medieval Buddhists, the possibility of experiencing adverse effects from meditation seems to have had nothing to do with the legitimacy or the authenticity or the level of enlightenment of the teacher, because 3 out of the 4 texts feature the Buddha's direct students getting ill. And in the Samyutta Agama, his followers become despondent and suicidal as a direct result of following advice given by the Buddha himself. Nor do the medieval sources suggest that it comes down to a question of students being unprepared. Indeed, the Shurangama Sutra warns that meditators will be attacked by various demons and other entities precisely because they've attained high levels of samadhi. And meanwhile, the Secret Essentials warns that severe side effects can happen to even someone proficient enough in meditation to have earned the name Nandi the Meditator. Indeed, Nandi is introduced elsewhere in a different text as an arahant, or who has attained realization, right? That's the highest level of achievement in meditation. So far from only happening due to the triggering of pre-existing psychological trauma, we're led to believe in these texts that these issues can occur for any number of reasons that might even just include loud noises, randomly disturbing your concentration. So surely we're meant to understand that these negative side effects could happen to anyone. These texts provide advice about prevention, Jury's admonishments to properly regulate your breathing during meditation, for example, is one. However, beyond prevention, the collection of texts contains even more information related to treatment. The chief assertion is that symptoms caused by meditation can be remedied within the context of an individual's meditation practice before they escalate into major problems. Some of the remedies introduced, such as Jury's grounding meditations that focus on attention to specific parts of the body that I was just talking about a couple minutes ago, seem fairly straightforward to understand. However, many of these medieval recommendations are phrased in archaic vocabularies like winds and chi, elements, demons, and such, that are embedded within medieval religious and medical culture, and that are more difficult to decipher from our modern vantage point. However, we're fortunate to have careful, philologically precise translations created by scholars who are intimately familiar with these cultural worlds. We can therefore be confident that we understand many of the remedies being presented in these texts, and that we have a clear sense of how they were understood in the particular times and places the texts were written. So we can unpack both the specific details as well as the underlying logics of many of these remedies. Not all, but many. With this essential background knowledge, and with good translations in hand, what possibilities do we have open to us? Well, these days, humanistic scholars tend to focus on reading historical texts in order to learn more about the cultures and societies in which they were written, and largely frown upon speculating about what texts like this may have to contribute to contemporary issues. In the discipline of the history of medicine, where I earned my PhD, the primary approach for some decades now has been to treat diseases as social constructs that cannot be equated across time or culture. Some practitioners of the history of medicine have argued for the value of using modern medical categories to elucidate historical events, but the very notion that texts from over 1,000 years ago might be mined for the development of modern clinical interventions would no doubt be roundly criticized as naively presentist. Meanwhile, in the history of religions, where I've made my second intellectual home, a few innovative scholars have recently used historical sources to make interventions in contemporary social and political issues. So here I'm thinking of Joy Brennan's use of Yogacara texts as a tool for deconstructing whiteness, and Amy Langenbird's reading of Vinaya texts to comment on sexual abuse in contemporary Buddhist communities. But notwithstanding these examples, the state of the field is still such that historians of Buddhism are typically encouraged to write about historical sources in ways that are critical, and to focus on historical and social contextualization rather than contemporary applications. So in contrast to those disciplinary norms that I just mentioned, I would like to suggest that the 4 medieval Chinese texts discussed here, as well as the many dozens more from this and other Buddhist contexts that speak about the potential dangers of meditation, might possibly serve as sources for practical, actionable approaches that could be adapted for the modern time. I suspect that medieval Chinese texts possibly could also contribute to diagnostic models that could help clinicians to discriminate between normal signs of meditation progress, adverse effects indicating that meditation is being done incorrectly, and true psychiatric disorders. So to be clear, I'm not suggesting that all of that can come straightforwardly just from reading a few passages written in the first millennium. I've already mentioned the critical role that extensive ethnography among contemporary Asian teachers and monastics should play. Rigorous clinical examination of any traditional interventions recovered from these texts would also be essential. It no doubt would also be useful. It would also be a useful control or corrective to compare across denominations to see how Buddhist advice for meditators in crisis compares with recommendations found in Hindu or Christian or Muslim or Taoist or shamanic traditions, among others. And of course, it's always a distinct possibility that following the advice given in these pre-modern texts could be found to be counterproductive for contemporary Western meditators. However, The principal point I wish to make here is simply that I think that historical texts from across the Buddhist world have an important role to play in contemporary conversations about the potential dangers of meditation. And by extension, that we historians would have something important to contribute if we were willing to jump into the fray. Where historians can contribute the most, in my opinion, is in the building of conceptual bridges. An immense cultural and linguistic gulf separates much of the discussion of symptoms in these sources from present-day medical knowledge. In my opinion, what's most urgently needed in order to even begin to work with these texts are accessible translations and explanations that attempt to explain these historical concepts in present-day language. So as a historian specializing in translation myself, I know full well that this is a razor's edge. A fast and loose approach would be disastrous for such a project, but it would be just as unhelpful if the end product was a sinological tome full of philologically sound but abstruse and inaccessible jargon. I think what's needed to pull this off is a transdisciplinary team of collaborators that includes ethnographers, clinicians, Dharma teachers, meditators, and a variety of others who can bring different perspectives to bear on that subject. And I believe that we historians need to take our seat at that table. We need historians who are willing to eschew our typical sinological arcana and instead produce work that's readable and understandable to contemporary medical professionals, non-academically trained meditation teachers and practitioners. And that's what I've attempted to do in this presentation, which I'm glad is going to be recorded and made publicly available. However, whether it's even possible to translate and interpret other texts in ways that render them clinically useful without doing irreparable epistemic violence to the text remains an open question, as is the matter of what kinds of translation strategies would best foster this kind of dialogue. And these are enormously complex theoretical and practical questions that are beyond the scope of my current talk. But with real patients experiencing real suffering, I think the stakes of doing this kind of transdisciplinary translation well are extremely high. In fact, I'm going to argue that it's a moral imperative. As meditation becomes ever more popular in the English-speaking world, and as it is primarily being learned via apps, websites, workplace workshops, self-retreats, and countless other ways that are outside of traditional institutional structures, a growing number of practitioners will inevitably be experiencing mental and physical symptoms that are exacerbated or caused by a practice that they believed could only be beneficial. When we read the firsthand reports, we're moved by the palpable anguish, despair, and harm that such experiences can cause. And at the same time, we historians happen to find ourselves in possession of rare and hard-won philological skills that could be directly relevant to understanding this phenomenon and to helping develop solutions. My question is whether we'll stay on the sidelines, letting the disciplinary norms and expectations of the 21st century academy limit our ability to play any other role other than an observer and a critic. Or will we embrace, in the words of the literary scholar Rita Felsky, a post-critical reading that allows us to look beyond our hermeneutics of suspicion and that may open up new possibilities for transdisciplinary humanistic scholarship. I know I cited a lot of work throughout the talk, so I made a reference slide for the video, and if anybody wants to take a photo of it, I'll leave it up for 4 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, and I'll say thank you very much. Oh, Woots? I'm getting Woots from the back of the room. So we have, are you moderating questions, or I understand we have half an hour.
I'll join you up at the top. Yeah, so it's a little past 6. I think we have the room for another half hour. Is that right? So, if you're hungry or tired or have other reasons to leave, feel free to leave. Don't be shy. But if you'd like to join a very exciting conversation that's about to take place, please stay. So, any immediate questions or thoughts? John has also done some work on meditation.
We're using the mic. Brilliant. Pierce, thank you so much for that. That was a refreshing take on mindfulness and meditation. And one of the things that strikes me about the occasional acknowledgement of meditation sickness or the dilemmas that can emerge is that there is a whole wing of mindfulness practitioners who will argue that there's a modern distinction to be made between authentic mindfulness, which is ancient and doing it correctly, and the modern corporate mindfulness, the McMindfulness, that Ron Purser talks about, and Thomas Joyner's book, The Corruption of Mindfulness in an Age of Narcissism. Like that we're just somehow not culturally prepared for this because back then there was this authentic mindfulness, and if you did it correctly, the results were inevitably, benefit and salutary. So one of the things I wanted to ask about is this is obviously like extremely relevant to those conversations already because these are ancient, original texts, as it were. But in those texts, the causes strike me as very interestingly unique to that time and place as well, right? There are a couple of causes where they see, well, in fact, quite often they seem to emerge from the scene of mindfulness, of meditation itself, as opposed to like, well, you have childhood trauma or you're in the wrong culture or any of the sort of explanations that a modern, practitioner might make today. And the answer, of course, is always, well, if you would do it differently, here's a different practice that would emerge. So more meditation seems to be the answer for that. So I'm just curious if that fact that quite a bit of it happens in the scene in terms of the way they're pathologizing this, as opposed to the practitioner's history or their cultural place, because quite often the way that someone would get diagnosed today is they would say, well, you have some trauma that you need to deal with, or you're not trained culturally to be a meditator. Maybe it's not for you or something. So it strikes me that there's like a difference in how we would pathologize those moments as opposed to how they're pathologized then. So could you talk a little bit about that difference?
Yeah, no, I think that's I think your question is going to be longer than my answer because I think you laid it out in the question.
But I'm sure you have more to say. Yeah,
it was precisely where that's precisely where the rub is, right? Our notions of etiology and nosology and symptomatology and our whole notion of epistemology is different than the context in which these texts were written, and so there's not going to be any kind of easy, set them side by side and A equals B sort of equation, right? This is a culture that doesn't have a notion of trauma, or at least not one like the way that we think about that today. So I think that we're not, I think I was trying to make the point at the end that we're not going to be able to just straightforwardly unpack these texts and say, look, this is what people should do, right? But through this kind of transdisciplinary conversation that should include, I think, meditators, meditation teachers, also psychologists, people that, there's a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists that are working with people who have had spiritual emergency or meditation-induced adverse effects now that are emerging. This is kind of like a little subfield that's emerging. And I think we need to have, like I was saying, a transdisciplinary conversation across all of these different parties in order to see whether these texts have any value at all. But I want historians to be at that table, right? Part of that conversation, and not just standing back, criticizing or critiquing or analyzing from our ivory towers, but actually down in the conversations, working out exactly those questions. So otherwise, if we're not there at the table, then who's going to be? Either the voices won't be there, which is the current situation, right? These historical voices, as well as contemporary Asian voices, just are not part of the conversation, or they're going to be presented by people who aren't necessarily grounded in the historical context and the social context of medieval China and are reading these texts from their own doctrinal or personal or presentist kind of perspectives, right? So, yeah, so I don't have an answer to the question. It's just like, yes, that's the problem, and I'm agreeing that is the problem. Hopefully, the first part of your question where you were talking about sort of the ease with which people can dismiss sufferers of meditation-induced problems as having just been unprepared, or, this is a Western thing. Like, hopefully the translation of these texts and bringing them publicly can at least do away with that misconception, and then from there start to tackle some of the questions that you're raising.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting. I wanted to ask a slightly different version of this question, in the sense of, you noted that the clinicians who are analyzing this problem are very worried about this problem, and are, people think mindfulness is going to be the solution to everything, but it's actually causing these real crises. People should be very careful when they meditate. There's this sort of idea that religion, if it's going to be used, it can only be, we only have space for it so long as it doesn't do any harm. Mm-hmm. And if it does harm, then we need to forego it, right? Like, then it has to be, excluded from the public sphere and the medical sphere. Like, it can't be a danger. If it's a danger, then it's a cult, and it's, bad religion. And that, in contrast, the conversation that you're describing among the medieval texts is, religion causes a lot of problems. Of course it does. That's kind of part of the nature, or whatever that, religion's the wrong word to use there, but this practice causes a lot of problems, and that's not to be unexpected, and nor is it a reason to stop doing it, the practice. It's in fact a reason to keep doing the practice in multiple different ways. So I just wonder about that complexity when trying to address this problem, right? That, like, I, as a scholar of religion, I'd love to be a part of more conversations, but the amount of people who get up and run from the room when they find out I study religion, it's like, 99% of them. So, wonder, if you have thoughts about that sort of that categorical shift.
So I'm fully aware of the likelihood that we're going to go from mindfulness is a panacea, it's good for everything, everybody should do it, it's completely safe, there's nothing wrong with it, to mindfulness is terrible, it's really dangerous, nobody should ever do it. It has no place whatsoever in therapy, because our culture is really good at that kind of like black and white extremist sort of thinking. But I think Ingram and Britton in her Cheetah House organization are perhaps onto a framework where we can accept kind of a little bit of gray when they talk about the informed consent model, because we already have a space within our therapeutic landscape in this country where, when you are prescribed a medicine, there's a warning label, and when you are at the hospital signing the paperwork for the surgery, you're signing off on the risks, right? So I think they're on the right track. Both of them are a lot closer to the medical field, and Ingram actually is a retired ER doctor, so he's much more in that field than I am. So I would defer to people who are sort of closer to that industry to say more about it. But it seems to me that existing kind of understanding, that's a place where Americans understand gray areas when it comes to healthcare. That this medicine is good for 95% of people, but there's 5% chance that you have an adverse reaction. And if we establish something like that for mindfulness, if that was kind of or meditation more generally, if that was the understanding in our culture that this is great for most people, but it's not right for everybody, and if you get into trouble, there are things that you can do to help. I think what at the moment, when we don't have that kind of understanding, when people have any kind of adverse effects at all with meditation, they're usually blaming themselves. What's wrong with me? I must not be doing this enough, or I must be the wrong kind of person, which only furthers. I mean, in the case of trauma, or the case of kind of the stuff that John was talking about, that can only just further that kind of negative spiral, right? And then if you have teachers that are unaware of these side effects, they potentially could be confirming that person's, worth, their dialogue of worthlessness and so forth. Teachers could be confirming that. So I'm just thinking that, like, if we had an understanding, if there is a framework that we can use to promote an understanding that there potentially are downsides, but that those downsides are predictable and they can be managed, and there are tools to manage them, and it's not your fault when you experience them, then I think that alone is gonna be a great service.
Hi, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. I have experienced, meditation sickness myself. So I wanted to ask you, because this is very, I would say, prevalent in other altered states of consciousness. So for example, let's say you go through an ayahuasca experience. You're going to experience the same thing, rolling of the eyes and compulsive movements. And, the notion of reality melts, right, in many ways. In that community, we call it like the ego is battling for like a previous notion of reality, and you're being exposed to new ones. So, however, when you're going through the worst of the experience, where you're feeling possessed by entities, or you're feeling all that disturbance, although it can be very undesirable, at the end of the journey, you get resolution, usually. So it was worth it. Like, it was worthwhile to go through that, because that was something that you had to face of sorts. So it is actually detrimental to run away from that type of process. So I'm curious how the meditation side of it treats it like an undesirable effect, when perhaps it is precisely obstacles that you need to go through in order to reach a new state of spirituality. And you mentioned Stanislav Grof with the spiritual emergencies, and precisely that's what it is. Like, it raises, but you cope with it, and hopefully you move past that. So I'm curious as why it is cataloged as undesirable, when in other processes or traditions, it is something that arises, and it is a symptom that is actually working, and you're actually confronting things that need to be confronted.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, thank you. So many things that were running through my head when you were asking it. The first thing that I was thinking that I should mention is, so I mentioned Daniel Ingram's organization, and they're trying to raise money to do research and so forth into emergent phenomena, and they're not actually limiting that to meditation only. There are also a number of researchers within that network that are looking at all sorts of different practices, including hallucinogenics, including other kinds of like yoga and Kundalini experiences, and all sorts of other types of things too. So there certainly are, among the researchers who are doing the medical and the scientific research, there's an awareness of sort of like a relatedness between those phenomena, for sure. So that's one. The other thing, you're hitting on, I think, a dimension of the texts, or a dimension of the material that I wasn't highlighting in this particular talk. But I think you're right that it's one of the most interesting questions when you look at these texts is where are they? They meaning the Chinese medieval authors that I'm reading here. Where are they drawing lines between what they consider to be normal progress or an illness, right? And so when they're actually talking about, when they're using the word illness, right, that word in Chinese is unambiguously bad, right? It means that a line has been crossed and there's something that needs treatment, something needs to be changed. But just shy of that line. So I was talking about things that texts that are already assuming that the meditator has crossed that line and has what they're defining as an illness. It's interesting to me to look at other texts and see what's not defined as an illness. Where is actually that boundary? Where does the practitioner go from this is a very difficult experience, but it's good for you, versus now it's a medical condition that needs treatment. That at the beginning of the talk, I was saying that that's actually one of the areas where I think most of the clinical research is too unaware of Buddhist doctrine when it comes to how they're looking at the adverse effects, because they're defining as adverse effects certain things that among many Buddhist practitioners would be desirable, right? Hallucinating a Buddha appearing into this room would be an amazing benefit and a marker of a real achievement for most Mahayana Buddhists, right? Whereas for somebody who's not steeped in Buddhist doctrine and is just at a mindfulness course, like that might register as a crisis, right? So I do think that Britton and Lindahl's work, if you're going to look at any of that research, because Lindahl is a religious studies scholar and Britton is a clinical researcher, and the two of them collaborate. And so I feel like that body of work tends to take more seriously the individual person's understanding of Buddhist doctrine and the teachings of the teacher that they're working with, and to draw some of those lines.
Could it be,
yeah.
for example, that they're coming from a Eastern medicine perspective, acupuncture, for example, in which, and I can attest for that. Yeah, of course, you have qi imbalance in your liver, like in traditional Chinese medicine, and that will provoke a lot of, extrasensual. So basically, you're being unbalanced. So it might be that they're drawing that line in, okay, you are, messing around with, the flow of qi, and that is unhealthy, regardless of the spiritual, doors that you might be crossing. That might be, because I think that's very prevalent. Like I have known people that, they go through these experiences very often, in my opinion, more than they should. And you definitely see a lot of, raising qi in their liver. Like if you look at it from the Chinese medicine perspective, so that would be considered like unhealthy, unsustainable spiritual growth. So that would be.
Certainly Zhi is operating in that world, because his recommendations, I sort of glossed over it for the talk because you can get really down into the weeds with, Indian and Chinese medical theory pretty quickly with Zhi. But his recommendations, many of them are specifically framed within the Chinese medical
actual remedies from Chinese.
Yeah. So they're not. It's not herbs and acupuncture, but it's that those 6 breaths, for example, each one of those relate to a different organ, and then there's other recommendations where he talks about specific to I guess the wuxing, like the 5 phases.
In that sense, there could be an argument for we Westerners not being ready. When you go deep into Chinese medicine and the relationship between, I'm sorry if somebody wants to talk about that. It's a very interesting debate. So when you go this route, and you acknowledge the connection between the mind and the points and the different channels, etc., there might be an argument that we as Westerners, once we are in that state, we don't have the cultural tools to cope with that.
Yeah, I would respond by saying we don't have the cultural tools necessarily to pick up a really dense piece of writing from the medieval China and understand what it's saying about qi, right? But my intention here is not to argue that in order to find a solution for meditators in crisis, that what we need to do is take on the whole Chinese worldview in order to help them, right? What I was talking about earlier, and especially in response to John's question, is just about is the difficulty of doing this, but the importance of doing this kind of like cross-cultural, cross-epistemological translation, right? So that these texts could be operationalizable within a mainstream American context by people who are not Buddhist, not Chinese medicine doctors, and that are running into trouble with meditation in their mindfulness course that's being offered by their workplace, right? And then what do? They go to their doctor, they go to their psychologist, right? Right? And without the knowledge more broadly throughout the culture, throughout American society, that there are these potential downsides and how they may be addressed, without any knowledge of that right now in the mainstream, it's potentially dangerous for somebody to go to the ER with meditation-induced symptoms, right? Because what actually could be something that could maybe just needs a little bit of time to pass, or might just be kind of like soothed with a couple of grounding meditations, right? But they go to the ER and they say that they're seeing, spirits and so on and so forth, and now they're, potentially medicated, potentially diagnosed in a way that's harmful for the rest of their life, potentially taking their rights away, right? Like, the stakes are really high when we aren't aware as a culture that meditation has the potential to have these kinds of events happening. So I don't think the solution is for ERs all over the world, all over the country, to like bone up on Chinese medicine, right? It has to be that we translate somehow this knowledge and these kind of like responses to those crises into contemporary biomedical, kind of contemporary American models, I think.
Well,
Yeah.
and we offer courses at university, right, where we can learn talk.
Nice segue.
We have a few minutes left. Does anybody have any quick questions or comments they'd like to ask?
First off, thank you for your talk.
Wait, can you start? I didn't hear any of it. Is it on?
I don't think it's on, but I can speak loudly. Thank you for your talk, by the way. What really resonated with you is when you were talking about the effects that this was having just primarily on Westerners practicing in mindfulness and meditation. And that made me think of this podcast I was listening to the other day from Ram Dass, and he was talking about how when he would go to Nepal and study in these monasteries, like the monks there that were so profound in their own profession of meditation and their own spiritual existence would be the biggest neurotics in the city of New York, and would be the ones going crazy and probably that we see on the street, like yelling and screaming. And that made me think of when I think of meditation, like at first I kind of approached it as we're humans reaching for spiritual enlightenment, and we're trying to get out of our bodies in order to do so. But recently I've kind of had this realization that we're these spiritual beings looking for human, like a human existence almost, and a better understanding of our own human existence. And I'm wondering if you think that there's a way to approach meditation from an educational standpoint as, yes, we are these spiritual beings and we're looking at meditation in order to more deeply connect with our human selves, and open almost the portal of our spiritual consciousness through our human self, instead of looking at it as experience of being human and then going absolutely crazy and reaching all these spiritual truths, which were already inherently within us. We're just conditioned not to think that they exist.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. So I'm gonna put on my scholar hat and answer that as a scholar, which might not be how I talk about that with you personally in like after the talk kind of thing. But I would say as a scholar, like what you're really pointing, one of the things you're really pointing to is the social context and how important it is for us to understand the social context in which these practices were originated, right? So you're right, these practices, all of the meditation practices originated in the context of an ascetic community, right? People who had removed themselves from ordinary kind of day-to-day lives with families and jobs and so forth. And were practicing within these kind of protected environments where they were, among other people who sort of were aware of the potential, deviations and were there to help and support each person kind of like in their progress. And the whole point was this transcendence of the kind of the worldly, as Buddhism always says. So then you take a look at what's happening in the U.S. right now, which is that those same practices are being adopted by people who are living in the world and not monastics, right? And they're trying to use those practices in order to get on better in their lives. And I think if you look at it like that, it might not be surprising that once in a while these practices hit somebody in a way that causes them to transcend in a certain way that is not sustainable in their culture, that they're not ready for, that they're not aware of even a possibility, and that can become psychologically destabilizing. And part of it is the way that mindfulness and in general, meditation more generally, has been sold to America, right, as this kind of like panacea that everybody should do, and perhaps that undervalues or underestimates the potency of these practices in certain cases. But I think your question, you're actually getting at something even deeper, which is this kind of like pathological American obsession with like transcending this world and this body and somehow like escaping the nitty-gritty kind of reality of human life, right? Which in many respects may be why many people are grabbing onto mindfulness instead of, or grabbing onto Buddhist meditation practice instead of like doing the harder work of kind of working through trauma and working through like, broken relationships and our broken society, right? And just trying to escape all that through these transcendent kind of practices. So I think you're onto something for sure. But yeah, thank you for the comment. Okay. Thank you, everybody.